Masculinity, a characteristic associated with things like this, or this.
Hell no, man. What the fuck?
Actually, I meant this. It's a concept that has been discussed and studied for thousands of years, if not more. The definition of conventional masculinity is a set of expectations and standards for men that define what it means to be masculine in a particular society. These expectations can lead to both negative and positive characteristics. Negative characteristics being where the term toxic masculinity comes from. These negative traits, if left unchecked, can outweigh the positive, which is dangerous. This is why Vinland Saga is such an important anime for young men to watch. It's a story that masterfully addresses the negative aspects of masculinity while highlighting the positive qualities. Through multiple characters, Vinland Saga displays the good, bad, and ugliness of masculinity. In this video, I'm going to break down exactly how Vinland Saga speaks to both the negative and positive aspects of masculinity, as well as the price you have to pay in order to be masculine. With that being said, let's just get right into it. Whenever masculinity is discussed, one of the main concepts brought up along with it is toxic masculinity. Toxic masculinity is defined as a set of attitudes and ways of behaving stereotypically associated with or expected of men, regarded as having a negative impact on men and society as a whole. Two major components of toxic masculinity are unnecessary violence and emotional restraint. Vinland Saga, being a show that takes place in the Viking era, depicts the height of toxic masculinity. From the very beginning, Vinland Saga places you in the midst of this ultra-violent and cold world. The anime throws you in the middle of a war at sea with no context, which is a subtle way of introducing the idea of unnecessary violence to the audience. Thors has this vision of his family, and after fatally stabbing one of the enemy soldiers, he witnesses their final words, which are, "Maria, I'm sorry." Frozen in shock, realizing he's the reason that soldier will never be able to see their family again, Thors gets struck by an arrow. After killing one more enemy and dropping his weapon, Thors flees the battle. 15 years later, Thors leads a peaceful life in Iceland with his wife and 2 children. Thors' story in Vinland Saga is used by Yukimura as the main precursor to explain the dangers of unnecessary violence. Thors found himself surrounded by a world of nothing but war and violence and decided to separate himself from that. In a world where a majority of men dream of dying in the midst of battle and going to Valhalla, Thors was one of the few people who questioned that way of thinking. The reason I call his story a precursor is because after coming to the realization that fighting is senseless, he's able to leave this violent lifestyle completely behind him. Well, almost, but I'll get to that.
You motherfucker!
While leading a peaceful life, Thors attempted to instill this value in his son Thorfinn. The idea that nobody is your enemy and that there's nobody in the world you need to hurt. Also, I want to point out the fact that while saying this, Thors is squeezing the dagger that he took from Thorfinn. It's a subtle detail, but very significant, as I'll explain shortly. One day, Thor's past life catches up with him and he's dragged back onto the battlefield. Thors was unknowingly taken into a trap set by his former comrade as a means of punishment for abandoning the Joms Vikings earlier. Thorfinn, who was a stowaway, becomes aware of the reality of the world. After Thorfinn is taken hostage, Thors agrees to battle Askeladd for the safe passage of his entire crew. The two duel and Thors comes out on top. However, Askeladd breaks the agreement and orders the death of Thors anyway. Going back to this panel of Thors saying no one has any enemies, the significance of him being cut while saying this to Thorfinn is that that's the price of living this life that he chose. Even while being cut down or shot with arrows, you have to remain strongly opposed to the idea of having enemies. Askeladd had no choice as the leader of a Viking group. After losing the battle, he would have lost their respect. Once again highlighting the violence and aggression as a negative tendency of masculinity. In this time period, a major part of respect was tied to your strength on the battlefield, which is why Askeladd couldn't just walk away after losing the battle. Even though Thors lived a peaceful life, he still fell victim to the uncontrolled violence of the world. This sets Thorfinn off on his own journey, living a life with the sole purpose of revenge, the complete opposite of what his father wanted. This singular event in Thorfinn's life leads him down a path of violence and solitude. This solitude came from Thorfinn's extreme emotional unavailability. All through Thorfinn's adolescence, we see his lack of emotional expression due to him suppressing them to become a better warrior. The only emotion Thorfinn portrayed to the world was anger, which led to him missing out on important things in life. Not only things like family and friends, but also his own personal growth. This is what Askeladd tries to teach him in both their final battle, where he straight up tells him,
"A fool simply loses because he's a fool. Although you have learned to think a bit when you fight. But once you inevitably blow your top, all that progress comes to a halt. It's your eyes that give you away. You're aiming straight for the nape of my neck. To go flying off the handle, screaming one's head off, and waving weapons around are things dead men do. It's as if no one around here can see so much as a shred of beauty.
Askeladd is literally telling Thorfinn the reason he can't get anywhere in life is because he's stuck in such an angry and violent state of mind in which there's no beauty. In Askeladd's final words, he tells Thorfinn to become a true warrior like Thors by leaving his unwavering anger and unnecessary violent tendencies behind. Thorfinn's entire character in the prologue is a distinct critique of traditional masculine characteristics. Season 1 shows the effects of uncontrolled violence and emotions not only inward but outward on society as a whole. The story of Vinland Saga depicts these negatives in a very clear way as to not glorify them. Not only does Vinland Saga highlight the negative aspects but also the positive aspects of masculinity. Masculinity is necessary in any proper society due to the main characteristics being leadership and willingness to sacrifice for the greater good. Leadership is shown through many people, for example King Swoon and Canute, who are completely different leaders. We see the importance of leadership and how it can influence so much in the world. King Swoon was more power hungry and focused on domination, which led to a more violent and war-filled era in England. Canute, on the other hand, as a leader, wanted a utopia-like world by destroying all the foundations previously set. Leadership relies on traits such as assertiveness, decisiveness, and dominance, which is why it's usually associated with masculinity. From Canute's first appearance, he was far from any of these traits, even being called princess by other characters. I want to discuss Canute's story in a separate video, but I just think it's important to highlight his leadership ability here. In order to become the Canute we see in Season 2, it took sacrifice. Canute had to sacrifice his past self and move forward as a different man. With being a great leader comes the need to be willing to make sacrifices for the greater good. A great leader must be willing to sacrifice their previous lifestyles, their body, and their ego. A leader who isn't willing to sacrifice anything is destined for failure, whether it's by their people turning on them, times changing and their lack of adaptation, or countless other ways. Even Thorfinn, after creating the goal of leading people to Vinland, a land of peace and prosperity, is the ultimate embodiment of this. His ability to sacrifice is what ultimately gains him the respect of the people around him. His willingness to sacrifice his body in front of Canute's guards gained their respect by showing his resilience. It's Thorfinn's powerful resilience that makes him such a commanding force as a leader. As a slave, he was able to stand in front of King Canute and share his views and ultimately gain him as an ally. Both Thorfinn and Canute sacrificed not only their past selves but their bodies in different ways. Canute, who believed in peace by force, trained his body to fight on the battlefield, and Thorfinn, who believed in peace by pacifism, chose to sacrifice his body by never fighting again. Both of these require putting your ego to the side. A king could easily say they'll never have to fight on the battlefield, so they won't train at all. On the other hand, a Norse man that doesn't fight back, regardless of how much he's hit, is normally considered weak, especially in this time period. As a result, the most important takeaway from Vinland Saga is that true masculinity requires sacrifice, specifically being able to sacrifice your ego. In a world full of unnecessary violence, it takes someone willing to be an outcast and completely going against that lifestyle in order to make a change. Being emotionally resistant is a sign of trying to protect your ego. In order to be a great leader, you can't be emotionally unavailable. If you restrain your emotions, you're bound to lash out and make an unwanted decision at some point in time. With being a leader also comes the responsibility to sacrifice. If you're not willing to make sacrifices for the greater good, then there's no point of being a leader at all. Vinland Saga is an important critique on the old ways in which masculinity was viewed and how we can learn and progress from those mistakes. If you made it this far in the video, I love you and I'm out. Peace.